Good morning, everybody. I'm Brian Silverman. I'm the Director of Channel Marketing and Partner Sales at TekMonks, and I'm joined today by Benazeer from CyberMinds Consulting. Benazeer, would you like to introduce yourself and the CyberMinds team?
Of course. Thanks, Brian. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. I am Benazeer Daruwalla, founder and principal partner at CyberMinds Consulting. We are a cyber advisory boutique based out of Brooklyn, New York, that specializes in services that take a context-driven and a risk-based approach to solving emerging cybersecurity challenges and use cases. Thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited to be here on this specific topic.
Yes, you and I started talking about this a few weeks ago to plan this webinar, and we were talking about this idea of enabling a secured hybrid workplace. And one of the things I think we both agree with is that companies did such an amazing job at the beginning of the pandemic to respond to enabling their workers to be able to work remotely, to provision hardware and technology and things like VPNs. But that, what was considered a tactical thing, and the many companies were hoping that their employees would be returning to work being the new norm, we now know that isn't the new norm, and that the new norm is really going to be this hybrid workplace. And that is whether employees, as Forbes mentioned, are happier, whether they're requiring a more of a hybrid work model as in the Gallup poll, and Gartner is really saying that to have a competitive edge, companies need to have this hybrid model of work strategy as part of their overall corporate architecture. And so hybrid workplace is now the new norm. Don't you think that's true?
Yeah, absolutely. So to your point, Brian, the pandemic has set a new era of expectations for the employers and the employees that's shaping the future of work. As you have rightly quoted here, the AT&T Future of Work study, although hybrid workplace will be a default standard or a de facto standard by 2024, the executive leaders are already exploring new ways to overcome the obstacles against this new models of working or new models of work by either building cultures remotely, as well as investing in tools and technologies that can enable and promote productivity and collaboration in a secure, efficient, and a consistent manner. It's a very timely conversation, very relevant conversation. In fact, I was talking to the client the other day, and they brought up the secure hybrid workplace as one of the core organizational drivers they want to build towards in their upcoming roadmap. So a very timely discussion. So thank you for having us again.
And what we think is that we've moved from this tactical to strategic. It's time for companies to look at reevaluating what their strategy and approach is. And we know there are many different issues here. There are cultural issues. There are how do you maintain collaboration in this more flexible work environment. But this morning, Benazeer and I are actually focused on two key areas. One, Benazeer is going to share with you her observations around cyber risk and the hybrid workplace, and her fundamental building block recommendations to minimize that risk. And then I'm going to talk to you about how you can not only increase the safety of your workers in this new world, but how you can enable improved productivity as well. So Benazeer, would you like to start sharing about the cyber risk and the hybrid work model?
Yeah, definitely. But before that, let's just touch quickly upon some of the cyber challenges and imperatives that organizations are facing. So we have listed three here, and of course there are more, but these three always come up on the top when we're talking to our clients during our engagements. Let's touch upon the first one. It's about aging cybersecurity footprint. Organizations have invested in cybersecurity solutions for decades now. Some solutions have evolved, some solutions have modernized as industry has evolved. Some solutions, not so much. Let's take an example of remote access VPNs that you touched upon earlier during our conversation. So remote access VPNs are a de facto standard for remote work, but they're also, the past couple of years also exposed fragility of remote access platforms, specifically in terms of scalability as well as in terms of security. Now you may say, hey, VPNs enable secure point-to-point communication. Yes, that's very true. But you use VPNs, if you're using VPNs on an untrusted network or on unmanaged device that might be compromised, or if the teams do not have not configured robust protocols and policies, then even VPNs are susceptible to attacks. And there's a general notion that once you remote access VPN into your corporate network, you are trusted and you have access to all the applications and resources, unless, of course, organizations have implemented fine-grained access policies, which, by the way, is very rare, you know, very rare in my opinion. Also, when you're looking at hybrid, the cloud infrastructures, more as companies are moving their workloads to cloud, you don't necessarily need to use VPNs. All you need is network connectivity and a browser, right? So what that means is the security operations teams are inundated with fragmented visibility and governance around who's accessing what, when, where, and how. In addition to that, the fragmented visibility also creates fragmented user experience. An employee in office will access things differently compared to an employee working from home. Same thing applies to an employee accessing an application or resource within corporate network has a different experience than an employee accessing an application or resource on a cloud infrastructure. So fragmented visibility, fragmented user experience, all becoming an important requirement or conversations to have when you're thinking about modernizing the cybersecurity footprints.
Benazeer,
the emerging requirements. So sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, don't you think that all that fragmentation also causes the employee to have less confidence in how they're accessing different resources and when they don't have a consistent approach?
Yeah, frustration, right? That's the point. And let me give you an example of us. We are management consultants, so we work with clients remotely, and sometimes we access, all we need is connectivity and a browser to access an infrastructure. In some cases, we have to resort to VDIs, which can be fairly slow and can be quite frustrating as far as experience is concerned, which can also impact our productivity. So definitely, the fragmented visibility, fragmented user experience is all accounting for the need for organizations to do not just security, but do it in a way that can provide a frictionless experience to the users. Which, by the way, also brings us to the next item on the slide around emerging requirements. We touched upon that earlier, but the industry is evolving very quickly. Business requirements are changing. Digitization is happening at a faster pace. We are talking about regulations specifically around compliance and privacy that are evolving at a rapid pace. And then we are looking at the threat landscape. As a result, the CISO teams have to continue to keep pace with the evolving needs of the business. And that's also prompting organizations to take a step back and refresh their cyber initiatives, modernize their cyber initiatives, include modernization as a part of the cyber initiatives. A good example is a work from anywhere model mandated by the pandemic has now prompted some organizations to take a fresh look at their current infrastructure. I've been talking to a few organizations that are now embarking on modernizing the infrastructure by implementing new technologies focused around SASE and ZTNA. So modernization to meet up with the emerging requirements is another imperative we are often come across during engagements, which brings us to the last point on the slide, which is around the delivery. So yes, the point number 1 and 2 result in cyber requirements. Now you have to look at those cyber requirements and deliver on these requirements through executable roadmaps. Now the problem is the CISO teams do not necessarily have a blank check, right? They need to ensure that they can prioritize those security requirements, communicate it, and then ensure that there is an alignment with the organizational drivers as within the constraints around resources and budget. So what that means is look at, you can't do everything. What are the top 5 or 6 items we need to prioritize that can bring us maximum value from a business point of view, reduce the risk, but also keep into consideration our existing constraints around budget and resources. So,
Uh,
four items.
and don't you think that if the security team works with those empowering these employees to this new flexible business model, they can also leverage a larger budget pool, if you will, because they're also delivering increased productivity along with security.
Exactly the point, right? Because now you're not just talking about security, you're talking about impacting the business in a positive way, right? So
Yep.
which actually segues very well into the next slide. So one of the deliverables we produce during our engagement is what we call as an action plan. The purpose of the action plan is to focus on prioritized list of controls uh, based on the ability to reduce risk, but also map them to the organizational drivers. Okay, so that mapping to the organization drivers opens up the discussion beyond security. Because now, if your organizational driver is we want to ensure that we enable remote work models in the future, now you're not just talking security, but you're also talking about how can we do it in a consistent and a frictionless fashion, because now it's going to impact the users. So the organizational drivers is a significant part of our discussion when we're actually creating these action plans. And for what we have seen is the top 4 or 5 controls that you see on the slide can, if done right, of course, if implemented right, can reduce the risk within an organization by 30% or more. And in case of a mid-size or large organization, this could be significant, right? The risk reduction could be significant in financial terms. So let's talk about these 4 controls for a bit. So the first control that often is talked about during our discussions around multi-factor authentication and user access governance of user access governance. And when I talk about users, it could include devices and systems as well. And this is a very strong and robust preventative control that can mitigate and reduce the risk of entry-level attacks, for example, credential compromise or credential stuffing or through phishing attacks. And now identity is a new parameter. So this becomes an important part of your risk reduction strategy. The second control that often comes up is around network border protection. Now, you're not necessarily talking about creating firewalls or intrusion detection and prevention technologies or controls. Here we are focusing mostly in terms of isolating the system components based on their criticality. So the concepts around network level segmentation or micro-segmentation is the front and the center of the discussion here. And if you look at segmentation or network trust boundaries or trust zones, they can be a significant risk reducing control, specifically by mitigating or reducing the impacts of lateral tool transfer, which more than often happens during a ransomware attack or even data breaches. So very strong preventative control that can reduce and mitigate risk. The third control here is around continuous monitoring. It's a detected control, it's a given. You need to monitor your network, you need to monitor your users so that you can detect anomalies and react to the anomalies in a timely fashion. So continuous monitoring is another control. And the final controls there are 2 different controls, which I have created separately here is because I believe they are foundational in nature. They need to happen irrespective. One is around asset classification and inventory. You need to be able to classify your assets based on the criticality. And when I talk about assets, I mean assets could be users, it could be devices, it could be software components, hardware components, anything that provides business value and is critical to the business. And then the second one is around cryptography, encryption. You need to enable encryption by default at the network level, at the data level, at an application level, or in order to ensure that you're minimizing and mitigating the impacts of information disclosure. So for important controls that can reduce and mitigate the risk by 30% or more, which can be significant in a mid-size and a larger enterprise.
Benazeer, I know these are important. We've been talking about hybrid workplace, and a lot of people may be thinking about this in terms of remote work. But do these change that whether they're physically, whether we're talking about the traditional office versus the remote office or wherever the hybrid workplace may be?
Now, these are important foundational controls, and if you holistically look at these controls, they have also formed the basis of zero trust principles, right? And zero trust principles is a crucial enabler of hybrid workplace strategy. So these controls, in some form or fashion, will work together in order to provide the ability to mitigate risk, irrespective of whether employee is working from home or is at home office, is at your corporate office. So definitely they do work together to create that seamless experience, but they are just not enough, right? Then you still need to include some level of dynamicity that can take into consideration the variabilities in the different work models, which I believe goes segues into the next slide. If you want to just bring up the building blocks.
There you
So as
go.
you can see on the screen, exactly. 90% of the organizations have some level of controls in place that we discussed in the previous slide. I think where the struggle is, how can the controls be orchestrated together to support a broader use case around remote work, right? And also ensure that they can mitigate the risk associated with remote work. So those controls are important, those controls are foundational, but in addition to those controls, we have added two more building blocks here. One is around the policy engine and the trust algorithm. This policy engine and the trust algorithm will take into consideration the dynamicity of the new work models that you just were asking about on the previous slide. So what does policy engine and trust algorithm do? They help with decision making and enforcement level decisions around access based on a trust algorithm, which could be context based scoring. And the context based scoring is something that could be dynamically calculated based on who's accessing the application resources, how the application resources are being accessed, where they are being accessed from, uh, the rationale behind the access, as well as other risk factors such as threat intelligence or anything that can help you make a dynamic decision whether you need to provide access to this particular application or resources within the trust zones that have been created. So to answer your question clearly, those controls help, but in addition to those controls, you want to introduce some level of dynamicity, which are those two building blocks around policy engine and trust algorithm. And if you have these right, then they can effectively contribute to enabling remote work in a secure and frictionless fashion. Now, I also want to highlight one thing on the slide is you may not necessarily see device management or endpoint protection or threat intelligence as one of the building blocks here. I just want to say they are also important. However, the focus of this slide was to talk about the top 4 or 5 controls that we believe need to be prioritized from an implementation perspective. So of course, there are other building blocks when we're talking about hybrid workplace, but these are the building blocks that I believe are essential to having the conversation on a prioritized basis.
That's great. And I think what's important about this is it's where you're talking here about anywhere, and that anywhere isn't just about the worker, it's really about anywhere, whether it's devices and resources that they're accessing, because as you started the conversation, they may have moved applications from within their infrastructure into the cloud, and most people have a combination of the two. So having this concept of zero trust and employees and resources being anywhere is important to building that foundation of the hybrid workplace.
Totally. Exactly. That's the point, right? And again, I want to again re-emphasize the fact that when we talk about assets, an asset could be a user, an asset is a device, an asset is a software component, hardware component, an asset. The important part here is in order for any asset to access application or resources, the trust levels are calculated in a dynamic fashion based on certain context, and the context can be derived or the context can be augmented, right? So I think that's an important thing to consider, which makes this hybrid workplace strategy dynamic and helps with that unique and consistent user experience.
That's great. So we've spent time with Benazeer talking about trust. We also see at TekMonks, part of that is to create a frictionless experience or a frictionless office. And Benazeer talked about building consistency in the user experience and the employees and how they access applications and resources. And we agree. And we really think about it as log in and get to work. And that is an employee or a user, whether they're physically at their home office, whether they're in their traditional physical office, maybe they're at a client location or even a cafe. The real issue is to build that consistency so that they can log in, they can access the necessary resources to be productive, and they can feel trusted in the environment that they're working in. So we thought the right thing to do here is to show you a demo of how this could work. Teleworker is our hybrid workplace portal, but what you'll see this morning is that we're actually logging in using multi-factor authentication. And because the user has been authorized, they now have access to their workplace portal. And you'll notice as we get started, what do you do when you first get in the office? You may check to see if your colleagues are in the office or who may be working, but you really start out logging into the key applications that you need to get to work. So in this case, it's me. I'm logging into HubSpot to see about the campaign to get people to this webinar, and I'm checking on that. The next thing I want to do as a marketing person and a sales leader is to go see what's going on in Salesforce with current opportunities. And you can see all this is happening, making the employee frictionless as they get to work, and I'm logging in there. And then you'll notice on the next thing, we know a lot of our clients have Microsoft Teams. They've already invested in a lot of other technologies, and we can show you that you can log in here into Microsoft Teams as well. What's nice from their point of view is that they have an API to do the authentication, so you don't see all the user ID login kind of things you just witnessed. This kind of access can also be for local resources. It could be for a legacy solution like a mainframe application or an internally developed application that makes the employee having all this centralized access to everything, regardless of where they are. So as we move forward, let's talk about trust, because Benazeer was talking about the trust algorithm and how you approach that. And what I think about trust is we deal in trust every day when we go work, we go to a business, we go to look in retail. We're always looking at people beyond what we actually see, what their ID, if you will, as we think about trust, is how trusted are we to do work with them. So in the trust environment that Benazeer is talking about, companies and that asset classification can determine what level of trust do they need to have for a user to be actually trusted to access that resource. So in this example, we're talking about categorizing different resources, maybe an internal web server. You have to have a 50% confidence that the user identity and the credentials match to who they really are. And for things that are more critical, say something like a human resources application or core financial applications, they need to be 90% or better. So how might that work in the reality? Let's say that I'm logging in from a cafe down the street. I'm using a weaker MFA question. If you could see the one that we used a few minutes ago, it was pretty basic. I'm logging in from a cafe where the network has no security at all. But again, I'm sort of near the office, and so my behavior is pretty consistent because our solution is login CAD and it is tracking my behavior as well. So it gives me a 60% confidence level that I am actually the person that was authorized to access these resources. Based on that, the system's not going to give me access to these core confidential assets. They're only going to give me 50%, or which is the internal website and potentially email. But as I finish lunch and I get back to the office, I'm now using a stronger multi-factor authentication resource. Maybe now I'm using biometrics as opposed to a second factor password. My behavior is a little bit normal because I'm accessing all these key applications, and I've logged in under normal conditions in a normal office at a normal time. Now my trust score, if you will, the verification or the assumption that I am who I say I am is up to 95%. And now I can have access to all those applications. Again, As an employee, it's still frictionless. I'm getting to work the same way, but this trust infrastructure, this zero trust environment that Benazeer shared with you, is protecting not only the corporate assets and information, but also protecting the employee from a trust standpoint. And finally, it's important also, Benazeer mentioned the network, that trust environment and those algorithms need to apply not only to applications and what the user is accessing, but also the network itself, because there's certainly many challenges. A lot of times what a cyber attacker is trying to do is to actually access a physical network and either place malware on a server or do things like that. So applying that trust approach and making sure that all devices are protected and trusted is important and needs to be thought of in a complete solution. And what we think about is bringing that all together into a trusted hybrid workplace. So you heard from Benazeer about how important it is to look at your environment, to review what you're investing in and where your priorities are, especially as we move to the hybrid workplace. And we at TekMonks agree that the right thing to do is to bring together a cohesive solution that brings the productivity of an employee portal where they can access work wherever they need to be, and the trusted security infrastructure below. The other thing is, Benazeer mentioned about fragmented, and what's important is not to look at this as pieces of solutions, but can you do something like we're talking about here this morning, where you bring it all together and make it as simple to deploy, simple for your employees to use, because that simple and familiarity builds security as well.
That's a good point, right? So one of the conversation, every time we have a conversation with the clients, some of the difficult questions we need to ask is ability of the existing investments to scale, the cost and complexity associated with those solutions, and as well as the time to value. There are three key questions and considerations to make in the decision-making process. For example, there are vendors that would pitch you solutions that need to integrate to create kind of a zero trust experience. And then there are solutions that provide you capabilities within a consolidated platform. So the decision-making process need to take into consideration the cost and the complexity, the time to value, as well as ability of these individual investments to scale and work together to create an environment that not only focuses on security, but also creates that frictionless user experience. So it's a great point you made, Brian, because some of my clients are actually looking for something that could be consolidated, could be as simple as or turnkey applications. Of course, they need to do the underlying legwork in terms of asset classification and establishing the network trust boundaries and configuring the trust scores within the applications, creating those access policies. Yes, that's all given. But at the end of the day, when it comes to deployment, I think the bigger question is how easy it is for us to deploy, what's going to be the time to value, what's going to be our ROI, and the management complexity going forward. So I'm glad that you guys have taken that into consideration in providing your overall solution.
And that's a great topic to take us to the wrap up, and that is, I was actually thinking of asking you the question when you're looking at doing an assessment and how you start to work with your clients, because I know classifying and prioritizing where they need to focus is important. So when you're talking about here an offer of an assessment, what are you proposing in this discussion?
So basically what we do is we offer a no-fee security readiness assessment for the specific use case we just spoke about, securing hybrid workplace. What we do is it's a 4-hour workshop, actually 2 to 4 hour workshop where we virtually work with you to answer a few questions that are part of our framework. And then we come up with a list of recommendations that you could use in order to help you plan and prioritize the next steps around creating an action plan for securing a hybrid workplace strategy. So this is a no-fee assessment, again, helping you ramp up and get you an understanding of what you need to be doing in terms of prioritization and in terms of controls for you to be able to be ready to take the next step in your remote work strategies. So Of course, a lot of vendors do that, but the difference between other vendors and us is, of course, this is a no-fee assessment, and then it's pretty detailed in terms of recommendation.
That's great. And so for those of you that are live, we are going to send out an evaluation. And if you're not live, we would love your feedback, and we'll show you our contact information in a moment. And then we also, from the TekMonks side, you saw a little bit of teleworker in that experience of the employee logging in, but of course, there's a lot more capability. So we're going to have a demo Friday on April 22nd at 11 a.m. Eastern time. And we will, you can look on LinkedIn as you registered for this event, and it will be there. And we'll also send out additional information after this webinar. Benazeer, I don't know that I see any additional questions, but do you have any, do you see any or any final comments?
No, I'm not seeing any questions. I think this was great. Thank you for sharing your solution with us. As I said, this is the right time for organizations to start looking at evaluating whether the existing solutions can scale to the emerging requirements, or they need to start modernizing and make some fresh investments in modern controls, specifically around that are focused around zero trust concepts and principles. So this has been a great conversation. Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah, and I think, what's interesting is it's always the balance, right, between the consulting and helping to prioritize and make sure a company is focused on what their priorities should be, but also having a complementary solution that can adapt for them as well. And I think this was a great way to start that conversation between us and with prospects as well.
I think the biggest challenge is not just implementing technologies, but transitioning to new technologies, right? We have invested in these legacy solutions. We are using application resources in a corporate environment. Now we're moving to cloud. How do we transition? What kind of decisions we need to make? I think that's where the difficult conversations come up. And so to your point, right, having the right subject matter expertise and advisory along with the right product can definitely help organizations get up and running quickly and reap the benefits and ROI as well in an accelerated fashion.
So that's great. We want to thank everybody for attending, and this recording will be placed in our YouTube channel. And here's our contact information. If any of you would like to contact us directly, I'm sure either one of us would be happy to discuss. And then if you'd like us to work together, we can do that as well. So thank you all.
By the way, Brian, just a quick note. My cell phone number is 646-946-4635. I think there's a typo there. So.
I apologize for that.
No worries.
Sorry about that.
I highlight that. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.